your fault he's dead.
This is one of the most heartbreaking moments in Disney history. But what if I told you it left scars on Simba that lasted a lifetime? If you've ever watched The Lion King, you probably remember Simba as the brave lion who left his carefree life behind to take back the throne. But Simba was actually dealing with something way deeper, something real people struggle with every day. I'm talking about post-traumatic stress disorder. When you really look at his story, the signs are everywhere. And once you see them, you'll never watch The Lion King the same way again. Think about it. Simba watched his father die in front of him, and not just any death. Mufasa was murdered in one of the most brutal ways possible.
Long live the king.
And the last thing he saw was Simba helplessly watching. And then Scar, the one lion Simba trusted, told him it was his fault.
It was an accident. I didn't mean for it to happen.
Of course you didn't.
Imagine the guilt, the fear, the confusion. Instead of having anyone to help him through it, he ran. That moment shaped his entire life. Instead of facing what happened, Simba spent years avoiding it. He distracted himself, convinced himself that his past didn't matter. Hakuna Matata wasn't just a fun song, it was his way of escaping.
Hakuna Matata! It means no worries.
Hakuna Matata.
And if you know anything about PTSD, avoidance is one of the biggest symptoms. And that's just the start. Throughout The Lion King, Simba shows other clear signs of trauma, flashbacks, fear, guilt, and even self-doubt. He isn't just a lion who needed to grow up. He was someone struggling with his past, battling his own mind, and trying to figure out who he really was. If there's one moment that completely changed Simba's life, it was Mufasa's death. This wasn't just a sad scene, it was pure life-shattering trauma. And when you really think about it, it's no surprise that it left scars on Simba's mind for years. Let's break it down. Simba started the day feeling on top of the world. He was still a young cub, full of excitement, trying to prove himself as a future king. Scar had tricked him into thinking he was about to do something incredible, practice his roar in the gorge. But in reality, he was being set up for something horrifying. Then, out of nowhere, the wildebeest stampede began. Imagine being a kid standing in the middle of a canyon watching the wall of wild animals charge at you. There's nowhere to run, no way to stop it. You're frozen in fear. And just when you think you're about to die, your father jumps in to save you. Now, at this point, Simba had already been through a near-death experience. That alone could cause trauma. But what happens next is what really destroys him. Mufasa manages to get him to safety, but he doesn't make it out himself. Instead, he's hanging from the cliff, clinging on for dear life. And then, Simba watches in horror as Scar throws Mufasa off the cliff. His own uncle, someone he trusted, murders his father right in front of him. Think about that for a second. It's bad enough that Simba had to watch his dad die, but Scar immediately makes it even worse. He walks over to Simba, and instead of comforting him, he blames him. He tells Simba that it's his fault that Mufasa died, that if it weren't for him, none of this would have happened.
The king is dead, and if it weren't for you, he'd still be alive.
Now remember, Simba is still just a kid. He doesn't know Scar is lying. He doesn't know he was set up. All he knows is that his father is gone, and the one adult he trusts is telling him that he's the reason why. That's emotional manipulation at its worst, and it does exactly what Scar wanted. It breaks Simba completely. So what does he do? He runs. This is important. Instead of processing what happened or asking for help, Simba does what many trauma victims do. He escapes. He runs as far as he can, hoping that if he just leaves, he won't have to deal with it. But trauma doesn't work like that. It doesn't just go away because you ignore it. From this moment on, Simba is carrying some serious emotional baggage. He doesn't even realize it yet, but this one event is going to shape everything he does for years to come.
You could have been killed. You put Nala in danger.
I was just trying to be brave like you.
And that's exactly what we're going to take a look at next. How Simba's exile wasn't healing, but avoidance. So after running away from the Pride Lands, Simba ends up in the jungle. And this is where we see a huge shift in his personality. He goes from a traumatized cub who just lost everything to a carefree lion who seems to have no worries. At first glance, it looks like he's moved on. But here's the truth. He hasn't. Simba didn't heal from his trauma. He buried it. Enter Timon and Pumbaa. These two are all about Hakuna Matata, the idea that life is best when you don't worry about the past. And for a cub who just experienced the worst day of his life, this philosophy is exactly what he wants to hear. No responsibilities, no painful memories, just fun and food? Sign him up. But here's the problem. Ignoring trauma doesn't make it disappear. It just pushes it down until it eventually comes back. And Simba is the perfect example of this. He spends years pretending his past doesn't matter. He doesn't talk about Mufasa. He doesn't think about the Pride Lands. He convinces himself that the lion he used to be, the one who dreamed of becoming king, doesn't exist anymore. This is classic avoidance, a major symptom of PTSD. Many trauma survivors do exactly what Simba does. Instead of facing their pain, they distract themselves with other things. Work, hobbies, partying, anything that keeps their mind off of what happened. But deep down, the pain is still there. And we see proof of this when Nala shows up. At first, Simba is excited to see Nala. She's a piece of his past that he actually misses. But the moment she starts talking about the Pride Lands, everything changes. She tells him about Scar, about how the kingdom is suffering. And instead of being concerned, Simba immediately shuts down.
You've been alive all this time. Why didn't you come back to Pride Rock? We've really needed you at home.
No one needs me.
Why? Because this conversation forces him to think about the past, the one thing he spent years avoiding. He tells Nala that nothing she says will make him go back, and when she pushes, he snaps. He tells her, "You think you can just show up and tell me how to live my life?"
Listen, you think you can just show up and tell me how to live my life? You don't even know what I've been through.
This isn't just stubbornness, this is a trauma response. When people go through something as painful as what Simba experienced, their brain tries to protect them from ever feeling that way again. And one of the ways it does that is by convincing them to avoid anything that reminds them of their trauma. That's exactly what Simba is doing here. He's afraid of facing the truth, afraid of feeling that guilt all over again. Because deep down, he still believes what Scar told him, that Mufasa's death was his fault. And this is why his reaction to seeing Mufasa again is so important.
You're the king.
Nala, we've been through this. I'm not the king. Scar is.
After running away from Nala, Simba finds himself alone, looking up at the stars. Rafiki appears and leads him to a pool of water, where he tells him to look at his reflection. At first, Simba only sees himself, but then something incredible happens. Mufasa's image appears in the sky, and here we see the first real crack in Simba's emotional wall. For the first time, he allows himself to actually feel something about his past. He's not ignoring it. He's not running from it. He's facing it. Mufasa's words hit him hard. You have forgotten who you are.
Simba, you have forgotten me.
No, how could I?
You have forgotten who you are.
And you can see the pain in Simba's eyes, because deep down, he knows it's true. He spends so much time running away from his past that he's forgotten the lion he was meant to be. This is the turning point. This is the moment when Simba finally starts to realize that burying the past isn't the same as healing from it. And that leads us to the next big moment. The moment Simba finally faces his trauma head on. A lot of people think PTSD only happens to people who go through extreme life or death situations. But the truth is, anyone who experiences a severe emotional or psychological shock can develop it. And when you really look at Simba's journey, the signs are everywhere. One of the biggest symptoms of PTSD is flashbacks, reliving the traumatic event as if it's happening all over again. And Simba experiences this multiple times. The biggest example, when he sees Mufasa in the sky. At first, Simba looks into the water and sees his own reflection. But the moment he stares at it long enough, Mufasa's face appears. Suddenly, the memories come rushing back. And when Mufasa tells him, "You have forgotten who you are," it's not just about his role as a king. It's about the fact that Simba has spent years trying to forget. This moment forces him to remember something he's been suppressing. And you can see the conflict all over his face. He doesn't want to remember, but he can't stop it from coming back. That's a textbook trauma response. We have avoidance, running from his past. We already touched on this, but avoidance is a huge sign of PTSD. Simba didn't just run away from the Pride Lands, he ran away from anything that reminded him of what happened. Think about it, for years he never talked about Mufasa, never mentioned Scar, and never even thought about going back. He created a life where the past didn't exist. And when Nala and Rafiki force him to think about it, what does he do? he runs. Avoidance is one of the most common coping mechanisms for trauma survivors. But like we saw with Simba, it doesn't actually fix anything. The past always catches up to you. There's guilt and self-blame. This one is huge. PTSD survivors often carry intense guilt, even when they aren't actually responsible for what happened. And thanks to Scar, Simba fully believed that Mufasa's death was his fault. Look at how he reacts when Nala tells him he needs to return to the Pride Lands. Instead of stepping up, he tells her, "You don't understand. It doesn't matter." Why would he say that? Because in his mind, he doesn't deserve to go back.
I can't go back.
Why?
You wouldn't understand.
What wouldn't I understand?
No. It doesn't matter. Hakuna Matata.
He thinks he's the failure. He thinks he's the reason the kingdom is suffering. Even though Scar manipulated him, even though it wasn't actually his fault, he believes it was. That's survivor's guilt, and it's another major sign of PTSD. Another PTSD symptom is hypervigilance, feeling constantly on edge, like danger could appear at any moment. And even though Simba hides it well, there are moments when we see this in him. One of the best examples is when Nala finds him. At first, he's happy, playful, and excited. But the moment she starts talking about responsibility, he shuts down completely. It's like his brain instantly goes into defense mode. And then there's his confrontation with Scar. Even when he knows he has to fight, you can see the fear in his eyes. He's tense, he's uncertain. And the moment Scar brings up Mufasa's death, it completely breaks him. Scar doesn't even need to physically fight him. Just mentioning Mufasa is enough to knock Simba down. That's a trauma trigger in action. The final stage of PTSD recovery is usually facing the trauma head-on. And that's exactly what Simba does in the last act of the movie, when Scar whispers, "It's your fault Mufasa is dead."
If it weren't for you, Mufasa would still be alive. It's your fault he's dead.
Simba reacts the way he always has. He believes it. He backs down, loses his strength, and almost gives up. But then Scar makes a mistake. He tells the truth. When Simba realizes that Scar was the one who killed Mufasa, everything changes. The self-blame, the guilt, the years of pain, all of it finally clicks.
I killed Mufasa.
Murderer!
He wasn't responsible. Scar was. And in that moment, you can literally see the weight lift off his shoulders. His entire body language changes. He stands taller, fights harder, and finally takes back control of his life. This is one of the most powerful moments in the entire movie, because Simba isn't just defeating Scar, he's defeating his trauma. When you put all of these signs together, it becomes clear. Simba's story is one of trauma and recovery. Disney may not have called it PTSD, but everything we see in The Lion King matches real-world symptoms. And that's what makes his journey so incredible. Because in the end, Simba proves that trauma doesn't define you. You can run from it, you can try to ignore it, but the only way to truly heal is to face it. And that's exactly what he did. Up until this point, Simba has done everything in his power to avoid his past. But now, the past has caught up to him, and it all leads to this. The moment where he either breaks or finally takes control of his life. Before Simba even gets to the Pride Lands, there's one major turning point, his encounter with Rafiki. At first, Simba reacts the way he always does. He tries to run, but Rafiki doesn't let him. Instead, he challenges Simba, taunts him, and ultimately leads him to the pool of water. "Look closer," Rafiki tells him. At first, Simba only sees himself. And this right here is powerful because it represents how he sees himself. Alone, lost, unworthy. But then Mufasa's reflection appears. This is the first time in years that Simba allows himself to truly think about his father. And when Mufasa appears in the sky and says, "You have forgotten who you are," you can see the realization hit Simba like a ton of bricks. He spent so much time running that he forgot who he was meant to be. And then, for the first time, Simba stops running. This is huge, because up until now, every time the past came up, Simba either lashed out or shut down. But this time, he listens. And when Rafiki tells him, the past can hurt, but you can either run from it or learn from it, Simba finally makes his choice. He's going back.
Past can hurt, but the way I see it, you can either run from it or learn from it.
Hey! Where are you going?
I'm going back!
Simba returning to the Pride Lands isn't just about reclaiming the throne, it's about facing his deepest fear. And when he finally stands before Scar, you can see how different he is. This isn't the same lion who spent years running from his problems. This is someone who is ready to face them. At first, Scar does what he always does. He manipulates. He mocks Simba, reminds him of Mufasa, and then he plays his final card. Tell them who is responsible for Mufasa's death.
Then you're guilty.
No, I'm not a murderer.
Oh, Simba, you're in trouble again.
Scar knows that Simba is still holding on to guilt. He knows that if he pushes the right buttons, he can break Simba down just like before. And at first, it worked. Simba lowers his head, guilt washed over him, and it looks like Scar has won. But then Scar makes a mistake. He tells the truth. When Scar whispers, "I killed Mufasa," you can literally see the shift in Simba. For years, he's carried this unbearable guilt, believing that his father's death was his fault. But at this moment, everything becomes clear. It was never his fault, it was Scar's. And with that realization, Simba finally lets go of the shame and self-doubt that have been haunting him for years. This is why this moment is so important. Simba isn't just fighting Scar, he's fighting his trauma. And for the first time in his life, he wins. When Simba finally defeats Scar, it's not just about reclaiming the throne, it's about reclaiming himself. He's no longer the cub who ran away. He's no longer the lion who spent years in denial. He's stronger. Because in the end, the Lion King isn't just about Simba becoming a king. It's about him overcoming his past and proving that trauma doesn't have to define you. And that's a message that goes way beyond just a Disney movie. For most of his life, Simba ran from responsibility. But not this time. He climbs to the top of Pride Rock, looks over the kingdom, and lets out a roar. This moment is so much more than just reclaiming the throne. It's fully accepting who he is. The lost cub who ran away, gone. The lion who believed he wasn't good enough, gone. In this moment, Simba finally becomes the king he was always meant to be. When Simba takes over, the Pride Lands are in ruins. Scar's rule left everything in complete devastation. The land is dry, the animals are gone, and everyone is suffering. This is a perfect metaphor for Simba's emotional state. Just like the kingdom, he spent years in darkness, but as soon as he returns, things start to change. With Simba as king, the land begins to heal. Life returns, the kingdom thrives again. This is Disney's way of showing us that Simba isn't just fixing the Pride Lands, he's fixing himself. His journey from trauma to healing is complete, and now he's finally in a place where he can move forward. One of the most powerful moments in The Lion King comes at the very end. We see Simba standing on Pride Rock, but this time, he isn't alone. Nala is beside him, and they have a cub of their own. This moment is huge, because remember, Simba lost his father in the worst way possible. He grew up believing he wasn't worthy, carrying guilt that wasn't his, and struggling with the trauma of that moment. But now he gets to be the father, and this time, he's gonna do things differently. He isn't going to abandon his child. He isn't going to let them grow up believing lies. He's going to be the role model Mufasa was to him. And that's what makes this ending so powerful. It's not just Simba becoming king, it's Simba breaking the cycle of trauma. He's choosing to move forward, to lead with wisdom instead of fear, and to give the next generation the life he never got to have. This is why Simba's story resonates so deeply with so many people, because in reality, a lot of us struggle with our pasts. We deal with guilt, self-doubt, and fear. We convince ourselves that we aren't good enough, that we don't deserve happiness, that we can't move forward. But The Lion King teaches us that we can. Simba's story is proof that no matter how broken you feel, healing is possible. No matter how long you've been running, you can still turn around. And no matter how much guilt or shame you carry, you can let it go. Because the truth is, your past doesn't define you. Simba thought his biggest battle was against Scar, but in reality, his biggest battle was against himself. And when he finally won that battle, when he finally accepted who he was, that's when he truly became king. Not just of the Pride Lands, but of his own life. So the next time you watch The Lion King, see it for what it really is. A story about overcoming trauma, facing your fears, and becoming the person you were meant to be. And that's why Simba had PTSD. What do you think? Did Simba's story hit differently for you after this breakdown? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this, be sure to join the Pride Lands.